We came out, awful announcing, we came out this week with our list of the 25 most influential sports media members of the last 25 years. I've got it pulled up here. I think at this point I can probably give it away without, diverting any traffic we'd be getting otherwise. In order here, we've got number one, Bill Simmons, Stephen A. Smith, Charles Barkley, Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon, Adam Schefter and Adrian Wojnarowski, Scott Van Pelt, Doris Burke, Dave Portnoy, Pat McAfee, Erin Andrews, Skip Bayless, Joe Buck, Bob Costas, Kirk Herbstreit, Jim Nance, Dan Patrick, Stuart Scott, Mina Kimes, Dan Lebitard, Mike Florio, the Party My Take guys, Tony Romo, Michael Strahan, Ernie Johnson, and Colin Cowherd. I guess it was interesting coming up with this. This was something we put together as kind of our editorial board who comes up with these sorts of things. We drafted a list. The initial list did not wind up being this list. Obviously, we debated it. We should have just screen grabbed those Slack debates that we had, because I think those were really, interesting and insightful and really could have been a podcast in and of themselves. It's interesting though, because you come up with the list and there are 15, I'd say 12 to 15 names that just have to be on there that we didn't even discuss in terms of debating. And then you have to come up with the rest of the list. And that's probably, I think ultimately it came down to probably just the final 4 or 5 spots, where we really had tough conversations about it. But I don't know what stood out to you about the list. What stood out to you about this process, and what did you make of this as a whole?
I like the idea, and it gets very interesting, and obviously this is kind of why it gets a lot of engagement. Is you can talk about the word influential in a lot of ways. There's a lot of ways you can influence sports media. So I think a lot of our debates were kind of centered around that. Is X person did they actually have any meaningful change on the sports media industry? And when I look back at the list, and I've had a few days to process what people have been saying about it and all that, I kind of all positive. I would say my one regret is I think we gave the play-by-play people a little too much love, because I think a lot of them are just kind of products of the play-by-play announcers that came before them. There's not too many that have truly changed the way sports are being broadcast or sports are being called in this day and age. So I think we could have afforded to, bump Joe Buck down a little, bump Jim Nance down a little. I don't know if I would take them off the list entirely, but that was, kind of what stood out to me when I was looking this list over. And if I had to change anything, that would probably be where my head is at.
Yeah, I think I probably had a similar reaction. I'm also just typically drawn to the personalities, and I think the personalities typically provide that sort of influence, whereas play-by-play has, there have been good play-by-play guys, great play-by-play guys, but it's largely been the same job throughout its history. There's not too many revolutionary play-by-play guys in this current century. I think that was also another part of it, is limiting it to this century and deciding hey, was this this person was influential, but was the influential part about them more in the Mike and the Mad Dog were right on the cusp. They were on one of our final drafts of the list. And it came down to they were more 90s guys than they were necessarily 2000s guys. And I think even looking at this, our list now, I see at least 4 or 5 names we probably could have had that discussion a little bit longer about. But ultimately, I like the list. I'm satisfied with the list. It's not, if I was writing this myself, it's not the list I would have came up with, but by and large, it's everybody on it. I definitely has a case. And I think, probably our 10 people who were on the outside looking in all had a case too. So it's just, again, how do you measure what's influential? How do you measure what that influence was in the 21st century? And ultimately, how much influence was there? So, we're not going to go by this all 25 guys, but the top of our list, one of the debates we did have was, Bill Simmons or Stephen A. Smith for number one overall. And we voted on it, and I think pretty unanimously settled on Bill Simmons as number one. I felt strongly about that one. I feel like as a sports website and a sports blog, and a website that writes about non-traditional things, like Bill Simmons is kind of our godfather. Like our website probably doesn't exist
Our
without
podfather.
our podfather doesn't exist with our site doesn't exist without the influence that Bill Simmons had in the early 2000s in the internet space. So I'm very deferential to him when it comes to that. But where did you shake out on that part of the debate?
Yeah, I definitely sided on the Bill Simmons side of things, and I think it's more kind of like you said, just taking a holistic look at sports media. Stephen A. Smith has had a profound impact on one part of sports media, which is debate television, and that's why he's number two, right? Because you see that's the format that dominates, television programming, studio programming in this day and age. Bill Simmons has expanded far outside of that, right? He's done the 30 for 30s. He's done other documentaries. He does the podcasts. He has the written content on The Ringer. I feel like his influence is just a bit more wide ranging than Stephen A. Smith. And, he's locked down, the largest sports podcast in the country for quite some time. As far as I know, I'm sure there's others up there, but the longevity of his podcast is also something to be considered. And if we're thinking about the time period, 2000 to 2025, he was influential long before Stephen A. Smith became the character he is today. So I think all those things kind of gave Simmons the edge for me.
We all came into it, I think, with if we were going to make our own list, these are the people we are pretty passionate about making sure get on this list. There are some people who, if we didn't have them on that list, I would have been legitimately upset and not, I wouldn't feel like it was I just felt very passionate about having these people on the list. I know who mine was. Who was yours for that?
I'm actually, I can't remember who yours is, but for me, it was Florio. And this is also a bit of a homer pick because we work for a sports blog, but Florio is also one of those people that changed the game, right? He is always out there, is probably having a dozen separate written posts on his website every day. He doesn't have to be doing this. He has a TV job, a podcasting job. He doesn't need to be writing about the minute happenings day to day in the NFL, but he still does. And he kind of he kind of fathered in the format that we like to copy here at Awful Announcing, which is we're going to be a clearinghouse for every little bit of sports media news out there, just like Florio is the clearinghouse for every bit of NFL news out there. So I think a lot of the sports blogosphere has kind of emulated what Florio did with Pro Football Talk. And he's just a bit of a more unique figure when you look at all the people on that list. And I think his influence is pretty profound on the industry.
Yeah, I love Mike Florio. I think he is somebody also who easily could have flown under the radar for us. And if we left him off there probably wouldn't have been a big outcry for where is Mike Florio? But I also think he's a name that when people saw it, they were probably oh yeah, that makes sense. That's everybody in the NFL reads Mike Florio. And yeah, I mean, to your point, not to toot our own horns, but there are a lot of talk shows and a lot of podcasts that I know go to Awful Announcing, and they find that's where they want to, because they know we have everything. We're covering everything in the sports media space the same way Mike Florio is covering everything, obviously on a much bigger scale in the NFL space. And so he definitely, I think, laid that blueprint for websites like ours. So yeah, I think that would have been a big omission not to have him on there. Mine is probably maybe surprising because it's not somebody who you would think Ben Axelrod is a huge fan of, just in terms of I don't know whatever people think about me, but Erin Andrews was mine. I think that was one because she, I think people forget like what a huge star she was. She still is obviously a huge star. I mean, she just did the sideline for the Super Bowl. Like she is one of the, if not the top sideline reporters, but that was such a trailblazer like job that she did in the early 2010s, doing the job that she did when she was at ESPN and then obviously later at Fox. I mean, I think there is an entire generation of sideline reporters who went to college saying, I want to be the next Erin Andrews. I think the way that she made sports more relatable to women at large, I think that's a massive influence. I think you look at what she's done with her fashion and her podcast and things away from her traditional job. I think you could say she laid the blueprint for like a lot of the influencers that we see in the sports space. So I think she doesn't always get the recognition that she deserves as a trailblazer in this industry. And I also think like I was like passionate, like, hey, she needs to be on this list, and she like should probably be higher than she should be lower.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. And I did see like a fair amount of feedback that was like Erin Andrews at 10. Like, why is Erin Andrews at 10? But
That
I
was too
think
low
people
for me.
forget. Yeah, like you laid it out perfectly. Like she inspired like an entire generation of young women to get into sports journalism, become sideline reporters, become just reporters. You know, it, she was kind of the first like household name that was like a women's sports broadcaster on like one of the most prominent, sports productions in the country. So I think there's a lot to be said for Erin Andrews.
Who's the name we left off that you're like, man, we could have had that one on here?
There's a couple that I'll give, and the way, like I was saying, the way I see it is like I'm looking at people that kind of changed the industry, like had an actual tangible impact on how sports media is covered or how sports media like behaves at this point in time. So, I saw Matthew Berry was left off the list. He was on one of our preliminary lists. I think he would have been a fine addition because he kind of pioneered some of the fantasy football and just fantasy gaming and betting content that we see plenty of today. And the other one I think is a fair omission or fair to bring up here is Clay Travis, because Travis has had a not to keep repeating myself, but a profound impact on how people view the sports media landscape. He's a bit more of like a political figure than he is a sports figure, in my opinion. So I think that was kind of the reason we left him off the list, in its final form. But if you kind of pay attention to how just regular people view sports media, I think he's had a really huge influence on that, especially in the way people perceive ESPN. And, I don't know if I would credit Travis for, changing the way ESPN has gone about its production of stuff. But, I think there's some probably halo effect there where ESPN sees some of that type of commentary and the support that it gets, and has probably made some decisions one way or another based off of that. So I do think he's someone who should have been strongly considered as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this about Clay, and he tweeted about the list. Not a fan of our list. We debated him. I mean, we had a conversation about him. He I don't know if we ever got to the point where he was on a draft, but he was definitely somebody we strongly considered. I think there was a case for him. I also don't have a problem with him being left off. Mainly, I'll say another thing about this list, like not to make excuses, 25 is a really small number for a quarter century, and to span all the parts of sports media. It's tough. There are a lot of names. I think Matthew Berry should have been on there. I think Darren Rovell should have been on there. Those would be like kind of my two who I would have picked, just because I've always been drawn to people who cover non-traditional avenues of the industry. And to that end, like, say what you will about Clay. I know we've said plenty in the past on our site. He created the leading conservative sports media website and sold it to a big company in Fox, and was on a national show. And I think we could have had him on the list, and it would have been totally justified. And I also think, like I said, the list had to stop somewhere. And ultimately, the way it shook out, I also don't have a huge issue with him being left off of it. But he was in the conversation. I think, you know, if anybody did this exercise, he would probably be around that cutoff point for them. So it is what it is.
Sure.
But
I think to me the discrepancy comes like, did you change the industry or did you change how people perceive the industry?
mm-hmm.
And I think he changed how a lot of people perceive a lot of the bigger sports media companies out there, like ESPN, like I mentioned. But I don't know if he's changed like how people produce content in the sports media space or what kind of content's coming out. So that, to me, that was kind of the distinguishing factor for him.
And I also think there is some overlap with him and other people like Dave Portnoy who are on the list. And so it's like, if we already have that, you know what I'm saying? Like if we already have that avenue of the influence covered, like why are we doing somebody who also influenced it, but in a similar manner? So I don't know. Like I said, he was in the conversation, but in
a similar vein, I was in for like combining Skip Bayless with Stephen A. Smith for that reason, because I thought their influence was like pretty overlapping, but there were some detractors on that.
That was a tough one for me too, because it was like because you raised that point. You said, let me hear the case for Skip Bayless. And I was of the same opinion. I was like, there are other people who like did the debate thing better and really brought it to more prominence, but he also was one of the first to do it. And he also like, I don't think we get this iteration of Stephen A without Skip Bayless. I think that's been pretty well established. So if Stephen A. Smith was at the point where he was in the conversation at one point to be number one on our list, then it's like Skip does have to be on there, I think, somewhere. We could have combined them though. That's probably valid. But also the other part, real quick, it's tough to deal with the recency bias, right? Because there is like, we're covering 25, 26 years here, and there's also an inherent recency bias that we're all dealing with. But that's look, none of these lists are going to be perfect. I'm proud of the one we put together, and I stand by it.